Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Benway, and today we have a very special guest. This is Professor Patrick Deneen, who's the author of Why Liberalism Failed. Now, we did a whole podcast about that particular book, and we're just very excited to be talking to the author himself and to be grilling him about what he actually said and if he really meant it. We're not so sure about that. Professor, it's a pleasure having you on. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, the first thing I want to get into before we actually get into the meat and potatoes of the book itself is how did you come about writing this book, and what was your objective in writing it?
Well, it's interesting. The book hit a moment, and obviously the moment is the sense of a lot of people that liberalism is failing, and the desire to have an explanation for what's going on. But this is a book that's really the culmination of at least a decade of thinking and writing. I mean, many of the chapters actually incorporate things that I'd written in other contexts and other places. So for me, the book seems something I've lived with for quite a long time, and just felt like the moment had come where some of my thinking about these matters had matured enough that it was time to put it between two covers. So I think, in contrast to what many people understand the book to have been intended to do, it wasn't really a commentary, or it wasn't intended as a commentary on our current moment, or really a kind of particular political moment, as much as it was aimed at a kind of diagnosis of kind of the trajectory of sort of Western liberal democracy as a whole.
Yeah, you're a professor of, for those of you who don't know, listening to us, Patrick, Professor Deneen is a professor of political science at Notre Dame. And what I found interesting about the book is that you didn't write it for the specialist audience. I mean, this seems like something that any bright, halfway bright freshman in college could pick up and get a clear sense of. Was that your deliberate intention, to make a popular book?
Yes, it was. Now, I worked with Yale University Press, and so I did want it to have a kind of academic credential, and that's kind of the coin of the land in academia.
Sure.
But I also knew that Yale was a place that was open to books that were of kind of a more trade press dimension. And so I was interested in working with them to see if I could kind of cross over. I'd been giving for a number of years. I'd been giving a lot of talks, especially to undergraduates. I was invited in many occasions to speak to, basically students, much like the ones I teach every day. And had, I think, as a result of that, developed a way of speaking and then writing that was aimed at a kind of smart, intelligent undergraduate who's trying to figure stuff out. And when I was writing this book, that was kind of my audience. I was trying to think of, how would you explain some of these things to a smart, obviously educated, but not an expert? And given how many young people, many of the schools I've been speaking at have come up to me and told me that they read the book and appreciated it, I feel at least some comfort that I may have at least partially hit that mark.
What's interesting question I have about that, the degree to which you think that the young people have really taken to this book, do you think that is in some sense a manifestation of a lot of these, as you would phrase in the book, the anti-culture that kind of permeates around them, the fact that there is a gap that they perceive that may very well be the byproduct of the liberal project? And you think that is kind of at play here?
Well, I certainly think that, and I'll have to say, I think it's probably a relatively small and self-select group that's attracted to a book of this title. But there is a lot of hunger to try to figure out how we've gotten to this point. And in particular, I think a lot of discontent with the kind of dominant partisan political explanations that most young people will have encountered, that it's the fault of the left, it's the fault of the right, that we see these kind of collapsing forms of civility and the kind of political crisis that we're witnessing unfolding in these very hours and days. And that it does seem that, I think especially with this generation, this is a generation that grew up completely outside of the shadow of the Cold War, and largely immune from many of the kinds of great ideological battles that certainly I grew up with, and perhaps you did as well. And so they're not satisfied with the kind of the explanations that are on offer that seem to be, that seem to explain something in an earlier era and don't seem to fit well with what they're experiencing. So I think they're pretty hungry for alternative explanations to what they see as, of course, our political crisis, and then, as you put it more broadly, the kind of cultural crisis that they're also experiencing.
Yeah, I think that it certainly speaks to me somewhat, and I would say probably the older or the eldest cohort that you could get from this. I was born in the mid '80s, so the Cold War, while ending during my lifetime, sort of predates my consciousness, really, and so that baggage really doesn't exist. The living memory of World War II, for example, was partially there. I mean, the grandparents existed, but has faded over time as that generation passes on. And I think the youngest cohorts from my standing that I think are conscious in talking about this don't really have those connections anymore. At least it's not motivating them in any
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, I mean, a book like this that's sort of taking to task our own political order and arguing that many of its pathologies arise from the heart of our sort of the deepest anthropological assumptions of our political order. It's almost unimaginable to write this kind of a book, obviously in the midst of the Cold War, when you're in this pitched battle in which liberalism is kind of the one thing between you and this kind of totalitarianism. So, it's definitely the case that the book itself required a kind of different context to get this kind of a hearing, and I was very conscious of that. But I do think that part of the interest in the book is the growing sense that it's no longer simply possible for modern liberal democratic citizens simply to sort of say the fault lies out there.
Yeah.
The fault is because of some other set of political commitments or cultural commitments, that there's something internal that's being, generated as a kind of contagion or pathology within our own order, and an inability of people to articulate exactly what that is. And so I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, just to thank me for at least articulating something that has helped them to think through their own kind of intuitions about what's going on.
Yeah, in my own case, I'm 50 years old, and so I grew up with the Cold War. I remember one of the earliest memories was, the 70s and Nixon going to China and such, and the whole notion of a potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so I grew up, I tended to be more conservative for various reasons. Principally, frankly, because my family's from Chile. And so we had direct experience with socialism under the Allende government, which was a complete disaster, and it really nearly broke the country. And so I had my family, my parents and I were not living in Chile during the Allende regime, but my grandparents were. And they would tell specific stories about what had happened. And it wasn't just them, it was everybody. And so my notion of being a liberal or being friendly to the left was colored by that, and so I never really was, so liberal as it were. I tended to be more conservative. But as the 2000s have wore on, and then into the 2000 teens, it seemed to me that the left, rather than being the loyal opposition, started going in a very bizarre direction. I mean, I looked at it as a man on the right, seeing as the left was just going a little bit insane. And yet, by the same token, on my side of the fence, I started seeing how the right was also morphing into this, markets über alles kind of mentality, which I for one do not agree with, because I think that markets and capitalism are a useful tool, but they are not an end in and of themselves for a society. You cannot have a society. My thinking, of course, was that you couldn't have a society that was only market based. That seemed absurd. And that's sort of like I started feeling both alienated from the left and from the right. And I started realizing, by the very nature of so many people following my content, that other people feel something similar, that they feel alienated from the center, and that people are being squeezed out to the extremes because the center, I hate to quote the Yeats line, but, the center cannot hold, apparently. And people are starting to be socialists or frankly, fascists. And they're starting to entertain fascist notions, which I find a little bit bizarre, to tell you the truth. Can you comment on that? Polarization and
Yeah, sure. Well, I one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I do mention this in the book, is how certainly during this period of the Cold War, you had this very defined distinction between the left and the right, and the right was, of course, dedicated to uh, liberty, a kind of individualism, a kind of a vision of a do-it-yourself human being that was largely equated, as you put it, with the way in which the markets could be the main avenue and tool of realizing this vision of humanity. And the left increasingly, and certainly as we got into the 60s, the left also kind of embraced a vision of liberation, of the do-it-yourself individual, of this kind of liberated self, this kind of self-making self, but it was through a kind of, originally it was through a countercultural move, which ironically enough became cultural. It actually took over the culture. And when we think of the main cultural institutions today, universities, media, and so forth, that's really the kind of where the counterculture became kind of cultural.
Yeah.
But notice what happened was that the left and the right were fighting these titanic battles between, these are called the culture wars, between whether your vision of self-realization was through the markets or whether your vision of self-realization was through this kind of in this cultural domain that was especially associated with the sexual revolution. And both were winning, and this is the kind of irony, is both actually, in spite of the fact that they were constantly claiming that they were, being defeated, on the verge of defeat by the opposition, both visions and forms of this kind of liberated self were actually winning simultaneously. The irony being that the right increasingly became politically ascendant and the left became culturally ascendant, when both of those, in a way, were in the other location where they originally kind of started from.
Yeah.
The right had originally been about controlling the cultural institutions and having a limited state, and the left was about sort of taking down the cultural institutions, particularly by running the state. And so we're in this kind of odd place now, where the left and the right are, they're both in a sense right, that they feel threatened by the other, and particularly by the territory that's held by the other side. But in some ways completely unaware of the fact that they have been mutually supportive of the project of this vision of liberation. And this gets us to, I think, where we are today, which is you now have these growing movements. And you mentioned fascism, a kind of proto-fascism, or kind of some version of a kind of right-wing authoritarianism, nationalism on the right, and a renewed interest in socialism on the left. And so you have, interestingly, these two reactions, which are intense rejections of this vision of individualism and this kind of self-making self on both the left and the right, that have this kind of now threat of spinning our politics into a very, potentially very dangerous place.
I think what was interesting about that to me is as even the phrasing of the right and the left, that presupposes that both you're sitting on the right and left wing of the National Assembly, meaning you have participated in the revolution already, right? And what's interesting now is it feels like fewer and fewer, or not fewer, excuse me, the opposite. More and more people are exiting that notion that we're participation in the General Assembly of the liberal democratic order. And I think, to me, what I think your book articulates well, and I think what people are probably responding to, is that I think hitherto, maybe let's say the past 10 years or so, I think people would have accepted a lot of the liberal axiomatic positions as just that, their axiomatic understanding of things as they really are, though the individual is the basis on the society, the Hobbesian vision of the world is just so, right? The state of nature is such as it is. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. But I think what you articulated well in the book is that, well, all of that is really a proactive exercise in kind of deconstructing the culture around it and consuming it and kind of tearing it asunder to create this liberal project where the individual, as articulated and enforced through the state apparatus, kind of pushes everything else asunder. And to me, what I think may be drawing the ire a lot is that action of making it very clear that there's a proactive effort on liberalism as ideology to destroy all those things against it just becomes more and more apparent recently, in the current years, it just seems more and more obvious to me.
Yeah.
I don't think the response against Trump necessarily, they're not really angry he's calling people poopy heads. I think they're angry at there's a notion that he even says the word deep state. There's an anger that he even criticizes the very notion of global commerce, more so than him having a bad character. I think that's just an excuse.
Yeah, I mean, what's really stunning about this Trump phenomenon? Of course, we're seeing this also in Western Europe, in the great advanced liberal democracies of the West. Is simultaneously, if you think about what Trump did, Trump first had to defeat the right. Right, we sort of think of him as this kind of quintessential conservative candidate, and then figure. I mean, at least as he's being painted in the media today. But the first thing he had to do was defeat the right, to defeat the mainstream right in America, which was basically defeating the vision of this idea of the globalized open market. I mean, he really was running on this idea that markets should in some ways be constrained to be able to take into account a national interest, and therefore merely settling on the view that globalized markets were always and everywhere good turned out to be very bad for some number of people who had a vested interest in a kind of more national form of economy. So the first thing he had to do was kind of to beat the vision of the individuated self in and through the marketplace. And then he goes after political correctness and the kind of cultural institutions, right? The fake media and the universities and so forth. His criticisms, once he gets to the general election, are all directed at the kind of the cultural left and the denunciations of political correctness and so forth, which is in its own way a kind of critique again of this idea of this individual self-making self that's been propounded on the part of the left. So you do have this very interesting moment in which today you have an alignment of people both on the right and the left who are anti-Trump precisely because he's taking on sort of both prongs of the liberal project and expressing in a very, I think, inarticulate and inchoate way a kind of deep rejection of the practical consequences of this 250, 300, 400 year project of remaking the world so that we would be liberated from sort of all forms of identity that weren't in some ways chosen and crafted and created by us personally.
All forms of
many people find that, and many people find that really a kind of condition that's both unbearable and inhumane.
Yeah, liberation of all forms of restraint. Because I was struck by in your book. I want to get into a different point, but I was struck by your book the very accentuation of the notion of what is liberty, and that the notion of liberty had been turned on its head by Enlightenment thinkers. And to tell you the truth, that seems to be the original. I don't want to call it the original sin, but the key move, the key argumentative move. Because before the notion was true freedom was freedom from your rational emotions, being able to dictate your life as opposed to being slave to your impulses. That was the key notion. And whereas now, under the Enlightenment thinkers, I mean, after Hobbes, basically, it's give into your appetites, and that's what we're living in today. Because you were talking about a do-it-yourself morality insofar as what the left started to promulgate during the '60s. But I wanted to ask you something more specific. You see that that there's like that liberalism is starting to decay. When do you think that inflection point happened? What historically in the last 2-3 decades, do you think it was a specific moment, or do you think that maybe the collapse of the Soviet Union removed a pressure to keep liberalism honest, and that's why it started to turn both corrupt and on the right, if you will, and nihilistic on the left? I mean, you see, what is it that changed that made it go kaflooey, to be perfectly vulgar?
Right, sure. I mean, there's always a kind of drinking parlor game in which you try to figure out what year everything went wrong.
Yeah, of course.
I sort of view it in the more classical context in which regimes are often compared to sort of human bodies. And, it's kind of hard to say at what point did your body decay?
Right. Yeah, it's impossible.
At what point did you, right? At what point did you begin to get old?
Yeah.
And you could say, in some ways, there's a kind of natural cycle of any kind of regime where it goes through, if it's going to survive for any period of time, it has to go through a period where it becomes strong and healthy and so forth. But then it's kind of internal, its internal dynamics lead it to a kind of condition of decay. So I'm hard pressed to think that there's a date or a particular moment you could point to. And the argument of the book is that, I think in ways you've been suggesting, that the definition of liberty, this transformed definition of liberty, from one in which liberty is understood to be kind of a form of discipline. You could say it's a discipline of individual selves, right? It's a kind of self-control, but it's also a political discipline.
Right.
It's the capacity to understand that law and more broadly culture, and the way in which culture and law operate together, is a kind of form of almost a form of civic education and a civic tutoring of our proclivities. I would say that there's a long story that I kind of tell in very brief and in kind of episodic ways in the book, but a kind of long story in which the internal dynamic of liberalism is a slow but unrelenting transformation and change, in which an older form and understanding of liberty is replaced with that newer form of liberty. It didn't happen overnight, and its effects weren't felt immediately, but that a kind of almost undeniable dynamic is unleashed and takes place once that reconception of liberty becomes dominant. And I think what you're pointing to is that what we're now seeing is the acceleration of these dynamics in ways that now they become really visible to us. And maybe the comparison is like when you reach the end of life, the underlying diseases and the underlying unhealth really comes to the fore. I'm not suggesting we're on the verge of imminent mortality, although I do often entertain this possibility.
Yeah, we do too.
Yeah, but it does seem like these dynamics are much more visible to us now in ways that they weren't, and I think it's in particular once the kind of formative cultural institutions that were once arrayed in defense of and in the effort of forming this human beings in this older form of liberty, once they've been completely in some ways decimated and swamped, which I think it's undeniable to conclude in our current context, that this dynamic now becomes much more visible in retrospect as well.
It's the the owls of Minerva.
It's the owl. It absolutely is the owl of Minerva. That in some ways the story only becomes fully visible once you reach the end. The last chapter.
Yeah, because I'm sorry, Benway. Go ahead.
Oh no, you go.
No, the thing that I'm kind of like struck with is that it seems as if we're circling the toilet faster and faster. Some of the things that are happening now in this year are kind of like unimaginable last year. For instance, this Kavanaugh situation. We can see clearly that a group of people set up to create a set of lies about a certain condition and a certain person in order to smear them in a way that is just despicable, really. Forget about the Blasey Ford accusations, which information is coming out, and as we are speaking and recording this podcast, the information is emerging that is casting enormous doubts over Blasey Ford. But the other two individuals that raised their heads, they are clearly making up stories out of thin air and smearing a man who you can disagree with him on his jurisprudence, but as a man, he's fairly innocuous. I mean, he's not some evil guy. He's not some crazy rapist or anything like that. But they are willing to smear him, which seems not merely a lack of civility, but a desperation. And I have no doubt in my mind that right now we're seeing the left acting in a desperate manner. I do not think that this will not happen on the right as well when they see that they are losing out. I mean, it's not that people can lose a fight and just lick their wounds and go on. they start getting hysterical. And there is a hysteria in the Western democracies that is, I mean, we see it on YouTube. We're seeing channels being taken down. We see Twitter accounts being silenced, banned for saying things that are objectively true. And that's very worrisome. You see what I'm saying? The hysteria.
Yeah. So I think at the end stage of liberalism,
Mm-hmm.
in other words, at the end stage when the effort to recreate the world essentially in the image of the individual in the state of nature. And this is really the core of my argument, that the idea of the state of nature, the idea of the human in the state of nature, begins as a kind of mental construct, as a kind of, a fiction that we use to assess where we are right now,
Yeah.
with this kind of more idealized version of the human being as this free and equal individual self-making self. And at the time that Hobbes, or at the time that particularly Locke is writing a kind of more positive assessment and description of the human in the state of nature, there's no evidence of any such humans, right? He's writing at a time when your name means who you are and what you're going to do. Like names like Smith and Weaver and Cooper and Taylor, right? That's not just a random last name. That's who you are and what you're going to be doing, right? Or in my tradition, in the Irish tradition, the O or the Mick in front of your name says literally who you're from. That who I am is who I'm from.
Right.
So when Locke is writing this, there's no evidence. You don't walk around the street saying, wow, we're also liberated and free and equal selves. That has to be created. And it requires a massive kind of architecture of state and market and society and education, a transformation of all of these sort of forms of human organization to make possible the creation of this creature that only exists in the theory of a number of philosophers. And to the point at which now we walk around and say increasingly this vision of this human type actually is manifest all around us, right? That we see more and more evidence of this creature. But at the end stage of liberalism, it's going to run directly and fiercely and confrontationally into that final frontier of the liberated human self, which is family and procreation, and the fact that we don't make ourselves, we come from other people, and that we don't get to choose our parents and we don't get to pick our children. And if you think about what are the most ferocious battles today in kind of the kind of culture wars, think about the stuff that's going on with the HHS mandate and the churches and the Little Sisters of the Poor, so issues over reproductive rights or birth control. Issues regarding religious liberty today, which are about gay marriage and reproduction as well. And of course, the whole underlying cause of this whole Kavanaugh conflagration, which is the panic, especially, of course, on the left, that abortion rights might get redefined and might be limited. And this goes directly to the question of whether or not we can be self-making selves. Can we essentially eliminate any consideration of the fact of our human biology in the reproduction of the next generation? Can we make that essentially a matter of complete human voluntarism and choice? And so I see the debate and all of obviously the many, many political implications and interesting maneuvers and disturbing manipulations that have been taking place really as a kind of manifestation of liberalism's kind of running hard into its final frontier. And this is the predictable result.
I've joked with Coach over here that it's almost like we're going out of our way to create the Cartesian concept of cogito ergo sum. Even if you think of transgenderism, it's almost like the accident of your physical makeup is that an accidental situation.
Exactly. No, so every aspect of your identity has to be subject to your own ultimately your own will and your own power. And transgenderism, of course, is a very kind of it's a perfect example of this. I mean, another one is this a very odd phenomenon, but it's quite big in academic circles to discuss this, which is this idea of voluntary amputation.
Yes.
The fact that like I feel like my arm is not a part of me and I want it to be amputated, and obviously it affects a tiny percentage of the population, but it's constantly being discussed by ethicists and philosophers as one of the great pressing questions of our day. Should there be a right to amputate a perfectly healthy limb because it doesn't conform with my sense of myself?
It seems insane. Although I have to admit that every couple of weeks I feel that feeling about my fingernails. But other than that, no. My arm, I'm happy with it where it is, to tell you the truth.
It may be insane on a visceral level, but to me, it's like you could take the logic and see where you get to that end. That's the oddity of it, is that it's actually logical.
Yeah, it is. And of course, this also, the next frontier of this, assuming it continues to move along, will be, and it's already happening, which is what's called often transhumanism, the ongoing effort essentially to control our genetic code and to create new forms of humanity by splicing genes and manipulating our genomes and so forth, so that we essentially can create designer babies, and in fact, maybe even create a creature that's no longer even recognizably human.
Well, to me, it seems like the Huxley notion of how humans are created conceivably can be a next step of what's happening. We don't need the families. In fact, the family is an unfortunate series of preconceived notions that we shouldn't force on an individual. Let's just breed people in mass production kind of way, and we can decide what roles are best suited to them. And that's the joke I always loved about Huxley, but I think it's the truth of the matter, was that Brave New World was a dystopian novel about utopia. Namely, you achieved what you wanted, but now you realize the harshness of it and the humanness of it too.
Yeah, there's been long-standing debates who sort of got the future right. Was it Huxley or was it George Orwell? And in the book, I kind of argue, in a sense, both did. Because what Huxley was portraying, what we've been talking about, he portrayed as a kind of people who would be very happy and amenable and comfortable with this situation. They'd be, it does describe a few ne'er-do-wells who are not along with the program, and they can be put off on an island somewhere. But that the state is largely benign, as encouraging this eugenic society devoted to pleasure and distraction. Whereas what we actually see is that in order to create this kind of individual self, in order to realize this liberated self, the state will have to become both very large, very powerful, and ultimately oppressive. Because it's not merely some one or two ne'er-do-wells who's going to object to this. There's large segments of our population that obviously don't believe ultimately in this vision of human, sort of the liberated self. They tend to be religious believers, not exclusively, but they tend to be religious believers. And what we're seeing is, certainly in the last administration, the growth of a state apparatus that would bring them to heel, in order, in some senses, to use the Rousseauian phrase, to force them to be free.
Yeah.
And so in a way, Orwell and Huxley both got it right to some extent.
Your story of the Amish situation, to me, was one of the great. To call it a set piece in the book seems odd in an academic book, but it really took the imagination when you tell the story of, after the Rumspringa event, 90% of the Amish returned to the community, and you had said, someone in your class had said, well, they just we need to compel them to freedom.
Yeah, that was actually one of my colleagues when I was teaching at Princeton University at the time. It was filled with good Rawlsian liberal philosophers who were outraged that given what liberalism envisions, which is the completely free choice of the individual, so that basically any arrangement and relationship and form of identity that one assumes has to be the result of consent, that in theory, the Amish should meet that standard by allowing their young people, and indeed forcing their young people, to go out and live among what they call the English, us, for a period of a year or two. And the fact that they were returning to an illiberal society in such large numbers suggested to my colleagues that they weren't actually being given a real choice, and in fact had been so deeply shaped and formed by their communities that they weren't actually consenting to this form of bondage of rejoining their communities. And so this is when my colleagues said, well, we should go in and force them to be free. And I did ask at that point, probably why I didn't get tenure at Princeton, I asked what would be the percentage that would confirm that they were actually acting freely. And my colleague said at least 50% shouldn't go back. So they're free when it's a coin flip.
That seems absurd. We were talking about your book previously with Benway, and Benway pointed out that in a very real sense, liberalism is almost like the Borg's ideology. You have to join the Borg, and anybody who doesn't want to, anybody who resists, is de facto wrong, by definition wrong, because everybody would want to be a good liberal, and that seems to be the case. I have to admit that the book struck me. Really struck me. I've read it a couple of times already, to tell you the truth, because I grew up under liberalism, and I thought it was, first of all, I didn't realize that it is an ideology. It's been a very slow process of understanding that it is an ideology, because you're part of the Borg. Once you're part of the Borg, it's hard to realize, oh, this isn't natural. This isn't the way things usually are. So it's been quite a slow process, an evolution on my part, to realize that I am living under an ideology, number one. And number two, what I'm struck by the most is how seductive liberalism is, because of all the ideologies. You mentioned communism and fascism, but we could also go to feudalism and previous social organizations. It's the one that provides the most material benefit. Now, I want to ask you, do you think that is specific to liberalism? Why is it that that liberalism as an ideology is so good at delivering material well-being? Is it because it's just a better use of capitalism? I mean, what exactly is going on? Or the very fact that it insists on everybody being a fungible individual, so the labor markets are so free to move people around to make it a more efficient, effective economy. I mean,
right? Yeah. No. In fact, most of my critics, especially those on the right, will often raise the question: well, what about the great prosperity of both the West and increasingly the world? Aren't these just de facto, contradictions of any criticism? So you get this. I mean, what's interesting is you get this argument on both the left and the right. So you have Steven Pinker making this argument in his book about enlightenment, and then you have Jonah Goldberg making basically the same argument in The Suicide of the West, that the sign of the success of liberalism is our material prosperity, and who can gainsay that? We can bring every statistic to the books. Sure. To prove this, and it's absolutely it's absolutely true that and as you point out, I think there are a lot of reasons why liberalism is really good at providing material benefits. I mean, it begins with the definition of what a human being is, and the human being is the consuming creature. That's the state of nature. In the state of nature, what we're just consuming machines. That's the core definition of what a human is. And so you structure society on the basis of that. We're consuming machines. And when you structure society on a certain vision of the human person, in all likelihood, society is going to do that fairly well. You unleash self-interest and greed. What used to be in some ways condemned in an earlier age is regarded now as a positive good. You're right about you liberate people from any sense of place or people or culture. So you create the fungible individual who is able to quickly move and alter, and in order to serve the productive needs of the society. And then one other feature that's worth mentioning is you transform our understanding of and our relationship to the natural world, so that the natural world now becomes a repository of the things that will satisfy us as these consuming machines. And so you have these proto-liberal arguments that you read in someone like Francis Bacon, or you see it articulated in Hobbes, and you certainly see it articulated in Locke, in which we are to be the conquerors of nature, and that nature is to become our subject. And this is really a fundamentally different way of understanding the human relationship to the natural world, in which, in a prior age, human beings understood themselves as part of nature, and therefore you couldn't simply subject nature to what we were also a part of, because that would be a form of enslavement. But by separating human beings from nature, we now make it the condition of our freedom is the subjection of nature, and thus why you begin to see the natural world as really basically just a kind of resource for extraction that gets us to where we are today. And in answer to this, I think you have to answer this challenge by questioning the premises of the question. If in fact we are just consuming machines, then it's doubtless the case that liberalism is the best political and social and economic order conceivable. If we're not merely consuming machines, if we're also creatures that receive deep satisfaction from our relationality and from a spiritual life and from a kind of capacity to live lives of leisure and contemplation and reflection, and we could keep naming different things that constitute the good life, then it turns out that liberalism is really good at one thing, and it's actually really bad at a lot of these other things. And if we look at a whole different host of measures, for example, there's interesting questions about levels of loneliness today, where you see these striking spike in expressed measures of loneliness, or the capacity to form meaningful and long-standing bonds, where we see all this feedback from the inability. The further you are in our generational schema today, the less likely it is you're going to form long-term, lifelong, meaningful bonds with people. I think on a host of different kinds of measures, we're actually not doing that well. But because we're in a liberal society, we tend to focus on the measures that liberalism values, and seeing those as those that demonstrate either health or disease, and discount the measures that would speak to a different part of what might be thought of as constituting human happiness.
No, Coach and I were having a conversation yesterday, actually, about which was on this front, which was how long will liberalism be able to buy off discontent, as it were? In other words, if you're fulfilling the material needs, how long will it go before people start being resentful? And I was on the question you had is like, well, what makes the good life? I was thinking to myself, well, it seems to me that a lot of the bigger and bigger sources of discontent are largely amaterial. So, for example, when it kind of ties us back to the Kavanaugh nomination, but not entirely just to him, but this, if you have a notion that the white male's time as a position of whatever, an active position in society, is past, and you really have no longer a place here, and we're going to actively ensure that that's the case. Well, it's hard to really buy that off. Take it more broadly. It's like any kind of culture you have, and we talk about multiculturalism, but I think it kind of gets reduced to, well, multiculturalism to us means that there's an Ethiopian restaurant next to a Chinese restaurant. If that's the sum total of Ethiopian and Chinese culture, that also will be a source of discontent, which, how often can you buy that off? It just seems like the non-material issues are increasingly becoming more and more of the forefront of consciousness.
Yeah, there's of course a lot of social science research that suggests that there is absolutely a need for a certain material standard of life to achieve some kind of human satisfaction. This is self-evident. You're not. Yeah. It's hard to be a happy person if you're not having.
The hygienic needs. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. But past a certain point, kind of you begin to see manifestations of a lot of characteristics that you would define as sort of forms of unhappiness. There's an interesting book by I think his name is Benjamin Schwartz, which is about the anxiety that's produced when you live in a society in which there's near infinite choice, and how this becomes paralyzing to people. That people become very unhappy when there's no choice. But it turns out people become very unhappy when there's too much choice. It produces a kind of deep anxiety and a kind of indecision. I mean, right. I think about how it must be for my students, kids 18 to 22 years old, in which you grow up in a world in which you have Tinder and I don't even know what the apps are now, in which basically, let's face it, the entire world is your mating marketplace. When I was growing up, it was basically your high school and maybe your college was your mating marketplace. And, you could find some good potential mates in those markets. And most of us did. And, at least for a period of time, in human history, you would stay married and with that person for your life. But once you create a global marketplace of mates, what this does is it institutionalizes discontent with any choice you might make. Yeah. Because it's like when you buy a car, the first thing you're thinking, did I buy the right model? And, is there a better version of this? And there's like owning an iPhone, because within 2 years there's going to be a better model. So I really do lament what it must be like for my students having to grow up in a world in which you're just constantly in this barrage of a sense that I can't settle on another human being as the person I'll devote my life to, because I've basically inhabit a world that institutionalizes discontent.
Yeah, there's something that I noticed. I mean, parallel to what you're saying, I was until recently I was living in London. I currently live in Kharkov in Ukraine. I was living in London, and one of the things I noticed was that my situation, my family situation, was quite privileged, and we were just enjoying the city. But most of the people I met in London, and I'm talking people who were fairly well off, they were in such a position that their need to finance their lives in London, a very expensive city, meant that all of their human relationships had to be in the focus or the service of providing more income. And so if a friendship developed, but that friendship would not lead to some sort of more money, basically, then that relationship tended to wither and die because the people would just focus their time and attention on the relationships that created more money or more opportunities for money. And then on the other hand, I've noticed I was recently doing some work on looking up how long people are spending in terms of paying off their student loans, and the average, shockingly, is 21 years, and the average debt load for Americans, at least, is $37,000, and it takes them on average 21 years to pay off that debt, and that creates an anxiety, an anxiousness. Because I don't know about you, but I've been in a couple of times in my life. I've been in debt that was, I nearly drowned in that debt, right? And because of that, I was extremely tense. And so you have students. You're talking about students who have a panoply of opportunities for mate selection that creates an anxiety because they're always going to be thinking, is this the right choice? And they're always going to be thinking, well, maybe there's somebody better, maybe I should wait, this and that. And then their debt burden. And then they're going to be going to some city and they're going to be struggling to just stay in place. And so it seems to me that this society that we've created, the liberal society, keeps you as a hamster running endlessly in every situation, the money situation, the romantic situation, the social and career situation. You're never at rest. You're never able to find contentment. That's the thing that strikes me the most, and I thank you for your book because it was able for me to crystallize a lot of thinking along these lines.
So to go back to our sort of starting point in our conversation, if your understanding of freedom, if your understanding of liberty is this kind of more classical or religious, certainly Christian understanding of a kind of self-discipline, what this means is that you're only truly free when you're liberated from the insatiable desires that defines what it is, at a basic level, that drives a human being. It's doubtless the case, and this is, I think, why liberalism has lasted longer than any of the other ideologies. Communism was just so patently out of keeping with our nature, denying that we love our families more than our strangers, or denying that we don't desire to have our own place and our own things and our own property. I mean, it was just so patently contrary to human nature. Whereas liberalism begins with something that's very true about human nature, that we are desiring creatures, and we do seek to satisfy our discontents. And we are driven by these longings that are ultimately difficult, if not impossible, to satisfy. And you had, I think, imperfectly always manifested, but a kind of one of the hallmarks of the West was a whole set of institutions and forms of education, cultural institutions, obviously religion, which sought to teach that you're only free when you're liberated from the insatiable desires that drive human beings. And what we've done, what I really think is the consequence of liberalism, is to disassemble all of those kinds of institutions and practices to redefine education. I mean, I think this is a core part of it, to redefine education, not that freedom is the liberation from these endless desires, but rather how we're going to get you in a position to fulfill as many desires as you're possibly able to, which is how you get people to go into debt and how you create this mad scramble for for the right job, and the kind of madness that we see on campuses today. And I think if to go back to an earlier part of our conversation, if we're seeing this sort of the consequences of liberalism now manifesting itself really fully in our day, it's now that we have achieved the very thing that liberalism set out to do. And as I argue in the book, we're failing. Liberalism is failing not because it failed, but because it succeeded. So at the moment when it's succeeding is the moment when you can see its falseness now revealed, right? The ideological falseness that is at its heart is now manifest to us in a way that wasn't, as long as you had this kind of, mixed quality, a kind of remnant of an older culture and an older tradition, still kind of coexisting in the liberal order.
How do you think? One of the last big questions I'd have for you is, as I'm looking through this book, and you certainly am seeing more and more people who would be responsive to it, but in this country in particular, the anxiety I would imagine this book would produce is forcing your students or anybody who reads it to begin to question the very project of the American state. By that I don't mean, the question that you are an American or not. I mean the actual project of what we were doing here with the revolution, with the Constitution and whatnot. Has anybody kind of try to articulate how they're responding to that? Because it seems to me that you can't not confront that as part of this story.
Yeah. Well, no, in fact, I've had quite a few critics, and again, they tend to be on the right, who have been, accused me of being essentially un-American and unpatriotic. There was one critic, it appeared in the Claremont Review of Books, that lambasted me for educating students and for miseducating them because I'm making them less. He, in fact, argued I was making them less likely to become good members of the Republican Party. It's kind of funny, but sad. But that effectively, I was discouraging them from becoming full-bore defenders of liberty as he understood it. I guess I would say the following, and I do I think point to this in the book, that I think there's been an America of its philosophy, and there's been an America in some ways of experience. The philosophy, and I think this is the philosophy of our founding, it's the philosophy of a number of our founding fathers, never was one that kind of wholly sort of shaped everyday life for American citizens. And this is something one of my favorite theorists, Alexis de Tocqueville, notes when he comes to America. He says Americans, they talk constantly in terms of self-interest, but they don't act that way. He says, I guess it's a wonderful line. He says, they do more honor to their philosophy than to themselves. I love that line. Because he says they talk like Lockeans, but they don't act like Lockeans. They act like, sort of small d democratic citizens who care about their places and their neighbors and their communities. And I think the problem that we're kind of now at the, kind of this inflection point is that we really have conformed ourselves to our philosophy. And we've lost whatever obviously imperfect practices that we could better perfect of neighborliness, of civic mindedness, of a concern for the common good, that I think you can see as having been operative in different times of our history, and it's hard to know how to reconstitute them once they've been sort of disassembled. And so at the end of the book, it's an argument that's caused a lot of consternation and dissatisfaction in a lot of readers. I kind of call for that the answer isn't a kind of wholesale redefinition of our political order, as much as that might be needed. It's actually a kind of retail project of working on building a kind of alternative way of life to the dominant liberal life. And it's one that needs to be done in a more conscious way and in a kind of almost countercultural way, or I call it a counter-anti-cultural way, in a way of trying to form and create cultures in our places and with our people. And this might be an unsatisfying recommendation, and maybe ultimately there is a need for a kind of more comprehensive political alternative. But I think that in some ways, to go back to that Tocqueville phrase, to be better than our philosophy is what's called for now. And that's something you don't have to wait for a new revolution to achieve. You can do that today. you can be better than our philosophy today.
Like, I can't tell you anybody in my kind of class cohort who really, in a serious way, goes to town hall meetings, goes to the library board, says like, hey, we always have this pothole situation. I know they sound trivial, but I think that's the kind of stumbling and fumbling you're trying to kind of articulate there. There is a local kind of community that you are involved with, whether you could be involved with, whether you like it or not.
Well, so ironically, again, we spent a lot of years, a lot of recent decades arguing about whether, we're more individualistic or we're more statist. And the true fact of the matter is that the more individualistic you want to become, the more statist you have to become, because to be truly political is to have to be involved, to have to get involved with the lives of other people around you. And what liberates us from that is when we rely on the state to do more and more of those things for us. And so the consequence of becoming a much more individualistic society is not one where the state withers; it's one where the state becomes more encompassing and assumes more of the powers that once might have been vested in local communities.
Yeah, my thinking about your conclusions, I was you are of the thought that there are basically two forks in the road, either a drift towards authoritarianism, or that liberalism will start to circumvent democratic processes and just try to force people to be good liberals. Either you basically were of the opinion that the drift is liberalism will just force people by fist to be good liberals, sort of like what's happening in the European Union, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, sort of like a clean break that leads to authoritarianism. Couldn't it be possible that it would be more like a continuum, that it would just drift from the forcing people to be good liberals to finally just saying, screw it, let's have a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime that is quote unquote democratic?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you see this impulse in a number of people, and
both on the left and the right, by the way.
Both on the left and the right. I mean, there's a book out by a gentleman named Jason Brennan, who was a libertarian, called Against Democracy. Basically, we should just have the smart people rule. It calls it an epistocracy,
which is basically what John Stuart Mill was advocating. So it's not new.
That's exactly right. No, it's a very old argument.
Yeah.
That's Mill's argument. That's exactly right. I meant to pose those as these two forks in the road, thinking that most of my readers would find them undesirable, and to sort of pose this like, if we're not going to fall into one or other of these kinds of two alternatives, then we're going to have to act with a kind of freedom. we're going to have to act differently. And so some people have read my book as this kind of Hegelian, like, this is where we're inevitably going and there's nothing we can do about it. And I really meant it to be like, let's wake up and act differently, and to be conscious of where we're likely to go if we don't act differently. So I meant it as a kind of encouragement. It's like, let's not end up in one of these two very bad places. And I think there are at least some signs that give hope. There are a lot of other signs that are worrying. But to end up where we began, the fact that so many young people are interested in this book, and I've been contacted by so many, and I've had discussions with so many, suggests to me that at least there might be, kind of a generation that's coming along that is kind of fed up with where we are and looking for something rather different.
I think that's the reality of what we're seeing on this channel. It's fundamentally our project.
Yeah, because what we're noticing is that people on both the left and the right are just extremely dissatisfied with the situation, and they are drifting to extremes, and it's just very worrisome. And it just points to the thesis of your book that liberalism is failing. And the dominant ideology of our times that has produced this incredible civilization that we're lucky enough to enjoy is sort of like on its last legs. So, Professor Deneen, we've tried your patience for close to an hour, and it's been a delightful conversation. And so I think that we're going to call it a podcast. Is there anything, a last thought that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I guess, just to reiterate what I was saying earlier, I think at this moment, and looking at our political order and so forth, it's easy to kind of fall into a condition of despair about our condition. And I'm not optimistic, but to use the old Christopher Lasch phrase, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful
Yeah.
that when things get bad enough, human basic human nature kicks back into being, and so I don't think, like, all ideologies ultimately are unsustainable because they're based on a kind of falsehood about human nature. So I meant my book as in part a kind of wake up call, but I think we're waking up, regardless of whether I wrote this book or not, that we're seeing a kind of unsustainability to this order, and a lot of good people and people of goodwill, I think, are trying to think and act their way out of this.
Yeah.
It's like Thomas Kuhn's crisis of a scientific theory
Yeah,
is reaching its terminus.
yeah.
Yeah, because I suppose I'm a little bit more black pill than you, because my thinking is, see, the three of us, not to be shy about it, or whatever, or false modesty, but the three of us are basically a part of the elite class in terms of educational background and all the rest of it, and yet the three of us, for different reasons and to different degrees, are alienated from the leadership class. Yet this leadership class of both the left and the right, government, media, private enterprise, what have you, they are hell bent for leather on maintaining the system,
Oh, absolutely,
and
absolutely.
they're willing to use force, and that's why I'm very pessimistic on a
Yeah.
personal level.
Well, I agree, but I've been giving a lot of talks, especially at a lot of elite schools, and
Mm-hmm.
my basic message has been: if you want to maintain your elite status, you're going to have to change things up, because they're going to be coming for you. I mean, you're outnumbered. You're
Right.
outnumbered by the people who are very discontent by this condition right now.
Yeah,
And
but they have the
unless
guns.
you,
They have
they
the
do have the
guns.
guns, but we know from a lot of revolutions that even if you have the guns, you can be swamped. So not to get too grim about it, but I do think, well, yeah,
Go ahead.
we're at
We
we're,
got
we're at
plenty
a,
of
no,
time.
we're at an inflection point, and it could go either way. So I think we should work hard at telling the elites that you're on the verge of losing, you know, the things that you hold dear, because you have lost legitimacy in the eyes of the broader populace.
But but
And
but but, but Professor Deneen, isn't it? I mean, indisputably true, the arrogance of our elites in the Western democracies, that they know best and that everybody else is a fool. I mean, look at the European Union. We don't have to look
yeah,
at the United States. We can look at the European Union with the European Commission. It is an arrogance that is indescribable. I don't want to have to. I don't think I have to go into specifics with you. I'm guessing that you have like a microscope to that situation. Doesn't that show the arrogance of the elites and their unwillingness and inflexibility, unwillingness to change and inflexibility in the face of obvious facts?
I, it's indisputable the case that there's an enormous arrogance and a very quick and automatic response to blame anyone but to point outward. I just think that this is a very predictable human impulse and a reaction, and if they are told sufficient number of times, and I guess I would have to say myself is part of the elite, and I do have a platform in the elite, which is helpful, uh, that it's in their self-interest
Mm-hmm.
to change the way in which they're thinking and speaking, and even who they regard as included in the community of the non-deplorables. uh, um, that that kind of a message, if repeated and if backed up by the feedback of reality, is likely to have an effect. In a certain way, it's a bit like, for a long time, people have denied a lot of the environmental catastrophes of our era because it
Mm-hmm.
served our interest to do so.
Sure.
It served our interest to do so. And at some point, the feedback from reality simply becomes too difficult to deny. And so some kind of response is required. And I think we're at the beginning of this point. The first response is, look, they want to protect their position.
Sure.
I mean, this is the classic oligarchy that wants to say, we're the ones who are entitled, and it's the unwashed rubes who are really to blame here. But reality is a hard master, and I just don't know how long. I mean, they'll deny it, but long term, it'll break one way or the other. And the question is whether it'll break in a way that doesn't wash them out to sea.
Yeah, so on that note, we'll call it a podcast. Professor Deneen, this has been delightful. I thank you so much for having joined us. Dr. Benway, is there anything, a final note that you want to leave us with?
No, just thank you for your patience with us and your time, and certainly hope more and more people come to read this book. I think there's a big population of folks ready to read it, if you know what I mean.
I appreciate it, and thanks again for having me on.
Okay. This has been the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill signing off for Dr. Benway. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.